I want to tell you about a decision I made in December of 1944. And I want to start by telling you that it was the right decision, because I need you to understand that the weight I have carried for 42 years is not the weight of having done something wrong. It is the weight of having done something right in conditions where doing something right meant something that felt like doing something wrong. And the difference between those two things, which is enormous in theory, becomes almost undetectable when you are standing in front of the specific person who will die because of the specific decision you are making. I am 86 years old. I practiced surgery in Baltimore for 38 years after the war. I have a wife, children, grandchildren, a life that is long and full and that I am grateful for in a way that I think only people who have seen what I have seen can be grateful for the ordinary texture of a life that continues without catastrophe from one day to the next. All of that is true. And alongside all of that, for 42 years there has been a tent in the Ardennes and a boy of 18 years old and a decision that I made in less than 2 minutes and that has never entirely finished being made. To understand what that decision was and what it cost, you need to understand what triage is. Not the word, which people know from emergency rooms and disaster responses, but what it actually is when it is operating under combat conditions with the supply lines compromised and the wounded coming in faster than any system can absorb, and the decisions being made with information that is incomplete and time that is insufficient and stakes that are absolute. Triage is the practice of sorting casualties according to the urgency of their need and the probability of benefit from treatment, with the goal of maximizing the number of survivors given a fixed and insufficient supply of resources. It is a mathematically sound approach to an impossible problem. It is also the practice of deciding, in real time, with real people in front of you, that one person's life will be prioritized over another person's life. Not because one life is more valuable than another in any moral sense, but because the resources available make it possible to save one and not both. And saving one is better than saving neither, and so you save one. The logic is impeccable. I believed in it before December of 1944. I applied it correctly in December of 1944, and I believe in it still, which is perhaps the thing that makes it most difficult to carry. Not that I made the wrong decision, but that the right decision has weighed on me for 4 decades in a way that is indistinguishable from the inside, from the weight of having made the wrong one. I was born in Baltimore in 1918. My father was a pharmacist, a precise and careful man who approached his work with a seriousness that I absorbed before I was old enough to understand what I was absorbing. He believed that doing things correctly was not perfectionism, but respect for the customer, for the medication, for the trust that was placed in him when someone handed over a prescription and expected that what they received would be what they needed. That belief entered me early and stayed. My mother taught piano. She taught neighborhood children in a room set aside for the purpose in the back of our house, with an upright piano that had belonged to her mother, and that was the most valued object in our home. She taught with a patience that I would spend decades trying to understand, and eventually came to understand only when I myself was in the position of teaching difficult things to people who were afraid. The patience of someone who knows that learning something real requires time and repetition and error, and that the teacher's function is not to prevent the error, but to remain present through it without withdrawing attention or expressing the kind of disappointment that makes a student stop trying before they reach the understanding that comes after the error. That patience also entered me, and also stayed.
I decided to study medicine when I was 15 years old with a clarity that I associate with the things we find rather than construct, the things that are true about us before we have language to say so. I wanted to heal. I wanted the tools that allow entry into the body and the correction of what has gone wrong.
I studied with the intensity that comes from doing the thing you actually want to do. Graduated in March of 1942, with Pearl Harbor 3 months past, and was conscripted before completing my surgical residency. The military training that preceded deployment taught me things that medical school had not. Triage chief among them. The theory of it, the criteria, the categories, the protocol that transforms an impossible decision into a sequence of answerable questions. What training could not teach, and what only December of 1944 would teach, was what it felt like to apply that protocol to a specific person in front of you who would die because of it. I spent 1942 and 1943 in military hospitals in England and North Africa, where I saw war at a sufficient remove from its production of casualties that the structure of medicine, the separation between the battlefield and the place of healing, remained largely intact. That separation ended in July of 1944 when I arrived in Normandy. A forward aid station is not a hospital. It is a temporary structure, usually a tent or the ground floor of a building that has survived the bombardment, positioned as close to the front as safety allows, which is never as close as would be ideal and frequently closer than is wise. Casualties arrive directly from the field in the condition the field has left them, and they arrive in numbers and with urgency that consistently exceeds the capacity of the system to respond. The station's function is to make the assessment that determines what happens to each man in the next minutes. That assessment is triage. And triage, I learned in my first weeks in Normandy, is something that theory describes and reality transforms utterly. What I learned in those first weeks was that triage is correct, and that being correct is not sufficient consolation. You can follow the protocol with fidelity, you can maximize the number of lives saved given the available resources, and you can still leave the station every evening carrying the weight of the men who did not receive the resources because the resources were allocated elsewhere. That weight does not have the simple address of moral error. It has the more complicated and harder to locate address of necessary action that hurts, of having done what was required and feeling simultaneously that something more was owed. I learned to carry that weight in the first weeks. I learned to continue functioning with it installed in the center of my chest. But nothing in those first weeks prepared me for December of 1944. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16th with a German offensive that broke Allied lines at multiple points simultaneously and produced in the first 72 hours a volume of casualties that exceeded by a significant margin the capacity of any field medical system prepared for that phase of the war. We operated continuously. No shift, no rest, only the uninterrupted sequence of casualties arriving and decisions being made and hands that had to keep doing what a physician's hands do, regardless of how long they had already been doing it. The exhaustion that accumulated in those first 72 hours was of a specific kind that exists only in situations of sustained overload, where the body continues to function, but the emotional buffering layer that normally exists between what you see and what you feel has been completely consumed, and what you see arrives without attenuation, directly. It was approximately 3 in the afternoon of December 19th when the two of them arrived at the same time. The first was a boy. He was 18 years old, according to the paperwork, 18 years old, which meant he had been in the war for perhaps 6 months at most, had enlisted or been drafted at 17, had trained and shipped out and arrived in Europe and been sent to the front and had not yet had time to become whatever a man becomes if he survives long enough to become it. The wounds were to the chest and abdomen, multiple shrapnel impacts that had penetrated at several points, and the rapid assessment I performed in the first 30 seconds told me what I did not want to know. Survival probability with immediate treatment was below 20%, possibly below 15%, possibly lower depending on factors I did not have time to evaluate with the precision I would have wanted.
The resources that would be required to try, the blood, the surgical time, the personnel, would be consumed in an attempt with overwhelming odds of failure. The second was a man of 35 with a serious abdominal wound, a single penetration that had struck the small intestine at a minimum of 2 points and was producing internal hemorrhage that was controllable surgically, but that without immediate surgery would kill him within 2 hours with a certainty that exceeded 70%. The resources required were the same as the boy would need, with the critical difference that in this case there was a reasonable probability that those resources would produce the outcome they exist to produce. I made the assessment in under 2 minutes. I operated on the 35-year-old. He survived. I was informed of this weeks later in a brief note in a patient status report, in the quiet, bureaucratic way that war manages its own accounting. He survived the surgery, survived the initial recovery, was evacuated to a safer hospital. The outcome was what triage had predicted as more probable. The boy of 18 died waiting. I knew it in the moment it happened, because I was in the same tent, because I heard the particular silence that replaces breathing when breathing stops, because I turned involuntarily for a moment and saw the nurse who had been with him. There was always someone designated to remain with those who received morphine in company while they waited, because no one should die entirely alone if there is any way to prevent it. Fold the blanket over his face with the precise and quiet gesture that war also teaches. The gesture that appears calm from the outside, and that you know is not calm from the inside. I turned back to what I was doing because there was always what to do, because there was always the next patient, because the machinery of triage does not pause for you to process what has just happened. I have been processing it for 42 years. I came home in July of 1945 and became the surgeon I had always intended to be. I practiced for 38 years. I saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. I did the work I had chosen with the seriousness and competence that my father had taught me to bring to the work one chooses. From the outside, it was the life of a successful physician who had served his country and returned to do what he had been trained to do. From the inside, there was that tent in December of 1944. There was the face of the boy whose name I do not know. There was the decision that was right, that remains right, that has weighed on me in a way that is indistinguishable from the weight of having done something wrong. Triage taught me what medical school had not taught, and what I needed to know before I needed to apply it. That medicine is not only science, but also tragedy. That healing, when resources are finite and need exceeds supply, requires choices that science can justify and that the soul resists accepting. That being a physician in time of war is to be the place where rationality and humanity meet, and sometimes cannot coexist without cost. I was only the doctor. That was all I was, and everything I was at the same time.